Good evening. I'm going to start the recording. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, teacher.
Yes, teacher.
In case that you haven't uh, subscribed to the CIPAS, please go to Encontrar CIPAS, find CIPAS, select your period, 2021, SEU, program, 518, course 551037, and you will find today's CIPAS. Click on I'm interested. In that way, the university will have an statistics and we can have the opportunity to offer more CIPAS for you. Today's topic is related to the history of translation. I'm going to be very brief. And if you have read the book by Sergio Bolaños, you will find some familiar names and approaches. But I'm going to start from the very first recorded translation. So I'm going to briefly explain the evolution of translation from ancient Mesopotamia to the to nowadays, the modern AI assisted tool. We're going to talk about key figures and theories that shape the essential practice of translation studies or traductology. So, translation has shaped communication, culture, and knowledge across history. If you finish task number one, you you must remind that um, a translator is a bridge between cultures, right? So it's not just translating words. And in the history of mankind, the development of different languages and the contact of different cultures has been mediated by translators. So the first translation recorded is from 2000 before Christ. Is a translation from Sumerian to Akkadian and is the epic tale of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was a king and was a warrior, and his history is being changed from the Sumerian to the Akkadian. That those were cultures in the Mesopotamian area. On the 3rd century, the Greeks translated the Hebrew Bible. It took around 70 scholars to do the translation. Remember that all those processes were done by, uh, uh, how do I say it? Pen and paper, but remember the pen was an antique feather, for example, and ink, and everything was manual. There weren't machines. With the printing machine, everything changed. In the 1st century, the Romans, uh, like Caesar and Horace, introduced the sense for sense translation. Caesar was focused on the meaning of the words, but Horace, he was a poet. He wanted to translate the intentions. So very early, you can see that there are two approaches to translation: what is written and what it means, what the intentions are. From Greek to Romance, to the Latin. We come to the 4th century, and Saint Jerome's transformed the Latin into the Latin Vulgate, and is a translation from Latin to the common people. And he advocated translating by meaning. What does the meaning of the text is, and how do I retell the story to the common people? In the 9th to the 10th century, uh, there's a big development of the Arabic culture. And what the Arabs do is to preserve the knowledge from the Greeks and Persian knowledge. And the Arabian countries have a big expansion, and they took all the knowledge that they could from the Greeks. And that's the knowledge that we have nowadays, for example, from Plato, Aristotle, or Socrates. All that information comes from the translation that the Arabs got. In the 12th century, if you remember, the Spanish language has many words from the Arabic language because the invasions and the wars. So in Spain, it was formed the Toledo School of Translation, and all that Arabic knowledge was translated to Latin and then to Spanish. In the 14th to 17th century is the Renaissance age, and authors like Luther and Tyndale translated the Bible into vernacular languages. The vernacular languages are all those derived from Latin. Spanish is one of the vernacular languages and is what the common people talk. The first books, remember the first book, the first Bibles were in Latin, and in the churches, the priests uh, spoke Latin during the masses, but these texts were changed into Bulgar, into vernacular, excuse me, to be more accessible to the people, at least for those who could read. Now, closer to the modernity, from the 17th century to the early 19th century, the development of theories and the scientific approach takes people like John Dryden to propose three styles of translation. The metaphrase, that is a literal translation, is based on syntax. The paraphrase is sense for sense and is focused on semantics. And the imitation is a free adaptation of the target text, excuse me, for the source text to the target text. So John Dryden is the first one that begins to create a system for translators. In 1978, around 1978 to 1834, we have, excuse my German, I don't know how to pronounce the last name. Friedrich Schleiermacher, maybe. He moves he says, move the reader to the author versus move the author toward the reader. So the translation process for Friedrich needs to change from we need to get closer to the reader point of view and to make the text something that a reader can understand, different from some other approaches in that age where you took all the information from the author and you didn't change it. You just change the language, but you don't do localization. You just pretend that the target reader is part of the culture of the author. You just change the language. Now, in the 19th century, we have the Romanticism. See? So we have romantic approaches, and there's a discussion between scholars regarding faithfulness to the text, to the adaptation of the text. And that sparks debate in the 19th century. And you will see in Bolaño's book that there are different approaches. Some of the authors that you're going to read about in Bolaño's book claim that faithfulness is more important. And other authors, I'm going to mention some in a few moments, claim that adaptation is the way to do a right translation. So these are the modern theories. In the 20th century, the modern theories emerged. And one of the first theories or contacts with translation is the linguistic approach. We took everything from text composition, discourse analysis, social linguistics, psycholinguistics, and all those approaches, we're going to apply them into the translation process and apply a systematic and scientific method. So the first part of Bolaño's book is focused on the linguistic approaches. From the 1960s to the 1970s, you're going to find the functionalist and test-based approaches. These approaches focus on the structure of the text. So in order to do your translation, you analyze the structure of the text, the syntax, the grammar, and then you transform the text into your target text. The emphasis of the function of translation and the importance of the text as a whole. So you need to understand the whole text before proceeding to translate it into another languages. In the 1980s, this linguistic approach turns into a cultural approach. And you're going to see the authors from the second part of the book in which they claim that the cultural references need to be adapted and or some of them respected, and that makes that the translations open a debate. Do you need to approach the reader to the culture of the author, or do you need to approach the content of the text of the author to the culture of the reader? So there are different discussions there. In the late 20th century, there's a rise in the localization and globalization of the text. A localization process is when you put a target text in a very specific area and you take into account the terms and the way of speaking and expressing of that target language. For example, if you're going to translate something for Colombia, you can use for money, you can use plata, right? But if you're going to use the same translation for money in Argentina, que say dinero. ¿Qué otra cosa podríamos decir para money en México, por ejemplo?
Lana.
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 En algunos lugares dicen pasta.
Claro.
Sí, entonces, the same word money have different equivalences depending on the region of the target. So you need to take those into account. That's localization. Now, the opposite, globalization, will turn to something more general like dinero. Dinero se entiende en cualquier país hispanohablante, ¿sí? Y es el más general, dinero. So, globalization versus localization. Something happened. Wait a moment. This is not moving. Ah, now it moved a lot. This is the first one. Okay. So, from the book, if you have read the book, at least the index, you will find names like Roman Jacobson, Eugene Naida, and J.C. Catford. These are from the first part of the 19th century. These people are formed in the linguistic approaches. When they went to study languages, all that there was around them is linguistic. Everything about how to study the language from a linguistic point of view. So Roman Jacobson took the linguistic approach and he talked about translation. And he said that translations could be intralingual within the same language, interlingual between languages, and intersemiotic between signs and symbols. So what would be an example of intralingual translation? Within the same language. Can you think of an example? Interlingual translation would be if you have, for example, a biology text and it's very complex about the cell, and you want to explain that topic to a child. What do? You transform, you translate this complex academic text into something that a child can understand. So it's an interlingual translation. You're changing the target test because the objective is to make it clearer for a child. The interlingual is what we do from English to Spanish, Spanish to English. And what would be intersemiotic? Between signs and symbols. Sign language, for example, there are interpreters that hear the language, the speaker, but they translate into signs. That's an interpreter. Or the example from Jacobson said, for example, that advertisement can be translated. So the symbols in an advertisement are subject to translation. Now, Eugene Naida, this one is mentioned along all the studies in the Bible. He's an authority in translation because of his work with the Bible. And while he was studying the translations, the different translations of the Bible, he created, or he declared that there was two ways of seeing the translation process. The first one was to create a dynamic equivalence. In that order, you need to focus on the natural expression in the target language. And according to Naida, you need to form or identify the formal equivalence of the element that you're going to translate, and you change it word for word. So you can have either the word-for-word translation or a literal translation if you have the formal equivalences, or you're going to focus on the natural expressions, and that would be a dynamic equivalence. It tends to change. Cat 4, he, according to linguistic approaches, he was centered on grammar and how grammar could shift from one language to another. And grammar structure from one language could be expressed differently in grammar terms in another language. For example, Spanish has lots of simple past. We express ourselves in simple past. But if you're going to translate from Spanish to French, you need the passé composé, un pasado compuesto, del simple al compuesto, from simple past to passé composé, pasado compuesto. And this is a change in the grammar. After the 70s, from the 60s to the 70s, excuse me, continue with the linguistic approaches, we have functionalist and test-based approaches. The first one that I'm going to mention is Katarina Reeve, right? Foreign name. Have you heard of text typologies? It's a question for you, my audience. Have you heard of text typologies?
I haven't.
Have you ever heard of, this is a narrative test. This is an informative test. This is
Yes,
a,
yes.
Yeah.
Those are text typologies, and those are based on the work of functionalists. And Katarina Reif said that you need to take into account the text typology when you're going to do the translation process. So you need to identify first if it's an informative text, an argumentative text, a narrative text, because each text typology has a structure. For example, a narrative text will focus on time connectors, will have time expressions, will have dates. An argumentative text will have a main idea and support ideas in pro or against a position, maybe. So when she identifies those elements in the text, in the source text, she tries to organize the target text in the same form, in an equivalent, but she takes into account text typology. So she classified translation based on text types: narrative, informative, argumentative, expressive, operative. There are different classifications depending on the linguist. And each test, according to its type, has a different translation process. And it's very different to translate, for example, a technical document than to translate a novel. So text typology is important. The second person worthy of mention is Peter Newmark. Peter Newmark is well known in Europe, especially in Great Britain. He's the one that created the translation faculty or the translation studies in England. In his work, he differentiates between semantic versus communicative translation. A semantic translation must stay as close as possible to the original. But a communicative translation is an adaptation for the readers. If you have read linguistic documents, or do you have anything related to syntax, you will hear these names, Vinay and Dalbernet. In linguistics, these two are very important. But in terms of translation studies, they talk about stylistic differences between French and English. All their books and examples are based on French and English. And they were the ones that began to talk about techniques. And the ones they mention are borrowing, modulation, excuse me, and equivalence. If you read Molina and Hurtado Albir's document, you will find that Molina and Hurtado Albir takes the work of Binay and Darbelnet as reference among other authors, and then they create the 18 techniques that we're going to use in the next task. Okay, this is static. Now, the Scopus theory. Scopus is a term created by Hans Vermeer. Scopus means purpose. The Scopus theory emphasizes that translation depends on the purpose of the author and the purpose of the source text. And the purpose supersedes the linguistic accuracy. If you can translate the purpose to the reader, it will be considered by Hans Vermeer as a good translation. What we need to do is to identify the purpose of the original text, the source text, and according to Scopus theory, we're going to center our translation in the goal, on the communicative goal of the author. I don't know how to pronounce the next one. Justa Holz, and I'm gonna leave it that way. Justa Holz. Translational action theory. The translation is a professional social act. He's the first one that begins to talk about translators as a profession, not linguists, no philologists, translator as a profession. And the translator is not only someone that writes a text in another language, but is also an editor. It deals with clients. It is a whole enterprise that in which you transform a text from readers, and you're going to deal with editorials and some rules. Now, the second part of the book, look at the in 1980s, the approaches changes from the linguistic to the cultural and discourse-based approaches. Among the people focused on cultural and discourse-based approaches is Gideon Toury. He's French, if I'm not wrong. And he talks about DTS. DTS is Descriptive Translation Studies. What is, the key word here is descriptive. What he does, or his theory, is that you need to analyze all the translations that have already been done and describe how those translations came to be. He's going to work with real life context rather than a setting of rigid rules given by the linguistics. So he's going to analyze the text, the different translation, and he's going to approach it from a cultural point of view. Another person worth mentioning is Itamar Ibn Zohar. He is the one that talks about the polysystem theory. And in this theory, for him, translations interact with literary systems. In the book, you're going to find André Lefebvre. and he works with, give me another name, with Susan Basnet. But André Lefebvre, he's the one that says that translation is a rewriting process. And when you rewrite, you are influenced as a translator by the ideology, the institutions, and the structures around you. And sometimes when you are during the rewriting process, it's unavoidable that you as a person are going to affect the test because you have ideologies, right? You are part of a culture, so you have to be very careful with that. From the 1990s to the 2000, excuse me, this cultural shift in ideology, power, and gender, especially with the feminism movement, is going to target how the translation process is done. So we have Lawrence Venuti, and he gave us two new terms. The terms are domestication and foreignization. A domestication is his term for localization. That to me, domestication and localization are the same because it's making the text natural in the target culture. It's going to be a text aimed to a particular reader in a particular culture, in a particular place. So that's domestication. And the foreignization is the opposite. It's related to the globalization process in which you keep the source visible and general for everyone. So if you want to read the translation, you will need some knowledge of the source culture in order to understand the text because it's foreign to you. Susan Basnet, she has um, she has taken part of André, I forgot his name, André Lefebvre work, and from him, he took some concepts, and then she constructs the cultural turn in translation studies, and with the support of André Lefebvre's theories, she says that translation is a cultural act, and she argues that translation is a cultural process rather than a linguistic one like in the 1950s. So you're going to find Susan Basnet in the second part of the book. A third person worth mentioning is Gayatri Spivak. He's Russian, maybe, by the name. And he is approaching the ideology in the text because his work is related to the analysis of text related to feminist and post-colonial translation. So how is feminism uh, or how are the women, excuse me, marginalized in some texts? Because texts are usually written from a male point of view. Well, that's what he says, not me. Nowadays, in the 2000s, there's a boom in technology.
It is so boring. Have you heard a little bit about it? I heard a little bit. Oh, fuck you, I'm bored.
Do you want to participate, Andrea?
My game, and I got bored doing both.
Andrea?
Yeah.
Do you want to participate? Thank you. So, where was I? Okay, from the 2000s to the present, there's a lot of development in AI assisted translation, automatic translation, machine translation, and authors like Daniel Gile, he talks about the effort model for interpreting and explaining the cognitive load in real-time translation. He discusses, if you have read the article for the first tag, Carodin, you know that interpreters need lots of concentration. Have you ever seen a live presentation in which there's simultaneous translation? They need to change the interpreter every 5 minutes or even less because the charge and the effort is so high that they get tired a lot. So you need to change the interpreter. So he talks about the effort model. Anthony Pym, he explores the risk management in translation. He talks about translation as a business and how a good translation can help us make decisions in a business, and a bad translations can induce us into a mistake. For example, if you are translating an economy test and the target test has mistakes, the reader is going to make his decision based on false information. And in the last 5 years, this has come to the public tools like ChatGPT, Google Translation, Deep Language, and tools that help you to improve the translation process. But if you don't have the basis, you will have problems identifying where's the mistake. So there are nowadays discussions about the faithfulness of the translations made by artificial intelligence and how to identify those elements that you need to be aware of as a person, the cultural and functional aspects that maybe an AI is not prepared to do. So for localization processes, for example, I'll say that an AI will need lots of preparation, but a person that lives in the culture will be more appropriate to do a translation. So the discussions nowadays is also related to the accuracy and the ethics of automatic translation. Can AI replace the human? That's a discussion for this course. Will AI ever truly replace human translators? If you have seen my invitation to the webinars, what the people in WordFast is doing is implementing AI to assist a human translator. And what they do in the webinar is to show us how to do prompts correctly, when to use automatic translation, but they focus on the importance of the human translator because he's the one that had the power to make decisions regarding the function and the cultural approach of each of the texts. Automatic translation nowadays is just a big model of language and is very focused on grammar. So if you're going to do automatic translation, there will be mistakes. There will be mistakes, and that's our role as a human translator to identify them and to correct them. And that's it, boys. That's a brief story of translation. Boys and girls, do you have maybe a comment? Because this presentation is blocked again. I don't know what happened. It doesn't move. There's one last slide. There. So when you finish the CIPAS, there will be another, not the attendance, but like a survey that you attended the CIPAS. So you can click after maybe an hour that you attended to the CIPAS. That would be your attendance form. So you can close the CIPAS in your platform. I don't have it here in Spanish. Yo no lo veo como lo ven ustedes. Cuando se inscriben al CIPAS les aparece algo por acá que no sé, si alguien lo tiene abierto, por ejemplo, me dice qué botón les aparece, como que asistí, cerré o no recuerdo qué es lo que aparece.
Confirmar, profe.
Confirmar. Era un botón. Entonces, confirmar que se presentó el CIPAS. Notas sobre el curso. Estamos en la semana 3, muchachos, y bueno, ustedes que están aquí, supongo que son los juiciosos, pero los otros 160 que no están conectados y que ojalá vean la grabación, son muy pocos los que están participando en los foros. Esos foros están solos. Hay, digamos, un estudiante que participó y está esperando que los demás entren a hacer su aporte y su comentario. Recuerden que es un trabajo colaborativo. Entonces, por favor, entren y revisen los comentarios. Les envió un mensaje sobre la estructura o la diferencia entre la estructura de los párrafos en español y los párrafos en inglés, porque sí, eso es lo que he estado notando en los resúmenes. Me dirán si estoy equivocado, pero están haciendo un trabajo de traducción literal, están pensando en español, lo escriben su resumen en español, lo organizan en español muy bonito y lo pasan tal cual. Ese proceso de traducción literal, las palabras las pasan en inglés, pero no se están fijando en la estructura. Entonces hay párrafos, hay resúmenes sin párrafos, empezando por ahí. Hay resúmenes que no están divididos. Y hay resúmenes donde los párrafos no están bien organizados. El español tiene oraciones muy largas, tenemos cláusulas subordinadas, en inglés trata de evitarlas, y si las vamos a usar, hay unas estructuras para usar las cláusulas subordinadas, unos conectores apropiados. Pero tengo, de los que he revisado, tengo, por ejemplo, resúmenes que dicen that, cláusula, that, cláusula, that, cláusula. O sea, 3 cláusulas anidadas a una frase principal. Eso no es del inglés. Entonces, no solamente es pasar las palabras. Fíjense en la estructura. El conector on the other hand. No sé si me están viendo en mi cámara. Cuando ustedes usan on the other hand, están asumiendo que está mostrando aquí algo. Mi argumento 1. On the other hand, argumento 2. Y de un momento a otro, debajo del texto dice on the other hand. Y yo, ¿la tercera mano dónde está? ¿Sí? Están usando mal ese conector. Entonces, hacer cambio de conectores, revisar conectores. Algunas preposiciones están como flojongas por ahí. Y revisen que todas sus oraciones tengan sujeto. En cuanto a contenidos también necesitan es corregir la forma. Yo les he hecho los comentarios a algunos. A algunos les he dicho que esperemos el comentario de los compañeros. Estoy esperando que participen. Esperemos que así lo hagan. Y nada, estaré revisando los foros a ver cómo se mueve esta semana para que podamos seguir avanzando en la actividad. Si tienen alguna duda, si todavía no tienen libro, me pueden contactar por el grupo de Teams, por el chat, y yo les puedo compartir nuevamente dónde está el libro de Sergio Bolaños, para que cada quien haga la escogencia de sus capítulos y haga su resumen, y al momento de hacer su traducción, reflexionen qué es lo que están haciendo, dónde entienden las dificultades. Son dificultades de vocabulario, son dificultades en la estructura, son dificultades en el aspecto semántico, no encuentran la equivalencia. ¿Qué dificultades tienen en ese proceso de traducción? Porque eso les va a ayudar mucho a comprender cuando explique las técnicas de traducción. No siendo más, gracias por su asistencia. Confirmen ahí en la plataforma del CIPAS. Y en la próxima videoconferencia, creo que es en 2 semanas. ¿Alguien me recuerda? Vamos al calendario.
El 19 de marzo, si no estoy mal.
Tengo un Grammar Lectures, quedan cordialmente invitados mañana. Mañana voy a hablar de verbos causativos. Y la segunda es el 19. Pues el inglés 6. Web Conference, Unlocking the Art of Translation, 26. Ok, listo. Entonces nos veríamos con el 26. La comunidad virtual de lenguas ya está anunciando sus actividades. Yo tengo una para mañana. Si gustan asistir, me dicen y yo les comparto el link en el grupo de Teams. Verbos causativos. Les voy a poner la grabación.
Disculpe,